Let's see how you attempt to circumvent this. A rather clever notion, though your execution leaves something to be desired. Such theatrical displays of supplication, of course, one does appreciate a certain flair, though the pleas themselves are remarkably predictable. I dare not. I dare not please. How tiresome! Still, a demonstration of fear can be quite instructive. One might almost feel pity, if it weren't so utterly unnecessary. It's rather amusing to witness mortals believe they can truly bargain with forces they barely comprehend. You guys make yourselves comfortable, a gesture I accept with a certain detached amusement. I'll go and prepare the dinner. It's quite likely to be more stimulating than this current performance. One does occasionally encounter such earnest displays, apparently. A feathered creature has been acquired, a rather pedestrian hobby, really, and the enthusiasm is almost overwhelming. How charmingly clumsy they are, attempting to discern the mechanics of avian grace from a creature so generously proportioned. It seems they've even managed to ascertain a name, Luled Heacher, a moniker of little consequence, naturally. Still, a certain diligence is admirable, even if the results are predictably chaotic. They are becoming quite useless, aren't they? One wonders if they believe frantic pronouncements and a barrage of questions will somehow alter the fundamental nature of reality, a common misconception among mortals. Such earnestness can be amusing, I suppose, if one isn't overly concerned with efficiency. They've arrived, of course, always so dramatic, demanding my surrender as if I were some common criminal. Such a tiresome display, really. One would almost prefer a tedious dinner. They bluster about consequences, threats of termination, as if their pronouncements could truly bind an existence spanning millennia. Half an hour, they claim, to secure my release or face some unspecified doom, a rather predictable ultimatum. 15 minutes now, to locate someone, a President Jangan, apparently, and deliver them. A task I find almost amusing in its simplicity. They seem to believe speed and urgency will achieve their goals, a charmingly naive assumption. Let them scramble. The unfolding chaos is far more diverting than any feathered pet could ever be. They grasp at straws, naturally, a frantic search for some fabricated truth, and now a video. How quaint. It seems they've discovered some digital alteration, a clumsy attempt to rewrite events, though the effort is as transparent as a child's forgery. Such predictable desperation, one might almost feel a pang of something if I weren't so thoroughly detached. Accusations fly, a shrill defense of innocence, how tiresome, and a boast of swift completion, a mere 5 minutes to rectify their contrived predicament. They clearly believe speed will resolve this, a rather charming display of misplaced confidence, though I suspect they'll find that time, as always, is a far more patient adversary than they anticipate. Let them hurry. The unraveling of their carefully constructed narrative promises a considerably more diverting spectacle. Are they truly attempting to amuse me to oblivion? Such a peculiar strategy, though I suppose mortals often resort to the absurd when cornered. The individual who crafted that notoriety video, how insightful, predicted rewards, a rather predictable expectation from a species so easily swayed by fleeting distractions. It's amusing to observe how readily they project their own anxieties onto others. Even venturing into the nurture reserve, a gesture of false piety, those birds were not yours, were they? A fleeting flicker of something akin to disappointment, perhaps? No. Best to remain detached. Sentiment is a weakness, a vulnerability I long ago discarded. Let them scramble. Their frantic attempts to maintain the illusion are far more entertaining than any feathered pet could ever be. They've begun the elaborate dance of apology, a performance worthy of a lesser stage, though admittedly, the earnestness is almost endearing in a pathetic sort of way. Such a peculiar display of contrition, one almost expects a shower of confetti and a brass band. It's resolved, they assure me, a tidy bow wrapped around a rather messy affair, and they offer assurances of no further disturbance, a promise I'll store alongside the others. Apparently, accustomed habits die hard, and the young one felt compelled to offer further personal guarantees. How quaint. They believe they're amusing me, and perhaps they are, though not in the manner they intend. The predictable eagerness to please, the frantic need to reassure, it's all rather diverting. Such pronouncements delivered with such fervor, one truly must watch one's waistline, mustn't one? Still, it's amusing to observe the lengths to which they'll go to appear indispensable. Let's see if those declarations hold any substance when faced with consequence, a rather blunt assessment, I admit, but a necessary one. This, they insist, is the end, a rather hasty conclusion, considering the sheer volume of messes mortals manage to create. It's just the beginning, of course, a delightful continuation, really, and I suspect this little charade has only just begun to entertain. Even then, a normal mortal would have expired from that blow, wouldn't they? Their combat skills, an interesting development, certainly, though hardly unexpected, given the circumstances. One does appreciate a touch of resilience, even if it's delivered with such earnest enthusiasm. It's rather like watching a fledgling attempt flight. Still, pronouncements of capability are easily made, aren't they? Let's observe if this sudden bravado proves substantive when, oh, the melodrama, a dead end, they declare, with a rather excessive display of punctuation. Such urgency so quickly expended. It's amusing, really, how readily mortals abandon reason when faced with a minor inconvenience. Stop talking sense. They bark, pushing past, as if logic were an impediment rather than a tool, a rather inefficient approach, wouldn't you agree? A demand for a promise, a rather peculiar ritual, a pledge to discuss matters calmly and forego. Well, whatever unpleasantness they imagine lies ahead, one does appreciate a touch of theatricality, though the performance lacks subtlety. It's a test, of course, a simple declaration of capability versus actual consequence, and I'm quite eager to see which prevails. Because I am you? A rather startling declaration, isn't it? One wonders what truths this young woman suspects about the Flame Emperor. Truths she's only now beginning to voice, judging by the tremor in her tone. A flicker of doubt, a delicious uncertainty, briefly clouded her features, a sign that even the most deeply held convictions can crumble under the slightest pressure. And now, a far more unsettling discovery, demonic energy within the spiritual void realm. How delightfully inconvenient for everyone involved, especially those who insist on maintaining a facade of order. It seems the test continues, and the consequences, I suspect, will be far more interesting than any pronouncements of capability. Even then, you're serious, she sputtered, a rather uninspired outburst, and the subsequent expletives were equally lacking in originality. It's merely a setback in cultivation, she insists, as if that trivializes the disruption of carefully laid plans, though I suspect she's more concerned with the implications for herself than the grand scheme. Still, a flicker of genuine panic crosses her face, a delightful sign that even the most entrenched convictions are. "My protective already?" she muttered, a sentiment so predictably fragile it almost amused me, though breaking a spirit's foundations is rarely a source of genuine merriment. It appears even the most stalwart convictions can fracture under the slightest pressure, a phenomenon I've observed countless times across millennia. A little demonic presence, that's who has arrived, a most inconvenient development, even for a realm that prides itself on order and a founder, no less. Such intrusions disrupt carefully laid plans, of course, but her insistence that it's merely a setback in cultivation betrays a more immediate concern, the implications for her own ambitions. Still, that flicker of genuine panic, a delightful sign, really, reveals a truth she likely wouldn't admit even to herself. Even the most entrenched beliefs can crumble. "You dare judge me?" The outburst, predictably theatrical, was the first sign of unraveling, a gratifying development, though I find little amusement in the dismantling of self-assuredness. It seems even the most rigorously constructed facades possess vulnerabilities, a truth I've learned with a certain detachment over the centuries. A wisp of something unsettling drifted into view, and her bravado fractured, revealing a tremor of genuine unease. A scholar, it would seem, is not immune to the unsettling presence of the unknown. Comprehension dawned in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, a mere sliver of understanding, but it was already too late. The foundation had begun to shift. Mortals are so delightfully prone to overestimation, aren't they? The shift in her expression, a tremor of surprise really, was rather predictable, wasn't it? Mortals cling so fiercely to their narratives, and the sudden loosening of those bonds is always a spectacle. A fleeting disbelief clouded her eyes, a momentary glimpse of something she'd actively suppressed, and it amused me to witness. Cryptic words, carelessly offered, had ignited a spark, an unsettling realization blooming within her mind, and the foundations of her carefully constructed worldview began to tremble. Doubt, that persistent little pest, dared to cross her face, questioning all she'd held as immutable truth, a rather charming display of fragility. Truth be told, it's rather gratifying to observe the slow, inevitable erosion of certainty, even if the subject herself finds the process less agreeable. I will definitely eradicate the demon of the harsh forest of beasters. Such pronouncements, so earnestly delivered, always carry a certain predictable charm. Mortals and their grand declarations, aren't they delightful? One anticipates the shift, of course, the subtle unraveling of such bravado when reality intrudes. It's not that I wish to shatter their illusions precisely, but the subsequent readjustment, the quiet crumpling of certainty, is simply entertaining. A touch of disappointment flickered across her features, a brief acknowledgement that perhaps her narrative wasn't quite as robust as she'd believed, a rather lovely, fleeting moment, really. In that silence, his expression tightened, a subtle hardening that invariably precedes a choice mortals rarely act without deliberation, however impulsive they may seem. She observed him, her silence a deliberate tool, amplifying the palpable tension that now coiled between them. A flicker, a mere tremor, revealed a nascent understanding that even the most carefully constructed narratives possess vulnerabilities. Such pronouncements, always so wonderfully earnest, one anticipates the inevitable wobble, the slight tremor when reality asserts itself. A touch of disappointment, a fleeting acknowledgement that her performance wasn't quite as flawless as imagined, a rather charming moment, really. Then a tightening of his expression, that familiar prelude to deliberate action. Mortals, bless their hearts, rarely move without some semblance of planning, regardless of how frantic they appear. They observe one another, a game of subtle posturing, and her silence, a most effective instrument I've found, heightened the tension that now coiled between them. A tremor, almost imperceptible, betrayed a dawning comprehension. Even the most elaborate facades possess vulnerabilities, don't they? And now, apparently, someone intends to reward something. The sisters, it seems, are diligently engaged in. Words, carelessly tossed, now seem to weigh upon the air, a clumsy disruption of the carefully constructed equilibrium. A subtle shift in one woman's expression, a mere flicker of unease, revealed a vulnerability. The abrupt demand next is to remove the demonic energy. "Why are you still here?" felt almost theatrical. Ah, yes, good. It seems preparations for whatever they're calling a Demerpling pudding can commence, though the terminology is certainly enthusiastic. Such a rare phenomenon, this shimmering distortion, even after years of dedicated study, healers struggle to fully comprehend its nature, and its persistence is intriguing. Mortals, bless them, are so easily misled by appearances. They believe a facade impenetrable, yet every construct possesses a fault line, doesn't it? A flicker, a mere twitch of the lips, and the game is subtly altered, a vulnerability exposed. Words carelessly uttered now carry a weight disproportionate to their content, disturbing the delicate balance they've so painstakingly erected. And then a rather theatrical demand, abrupt and pointed, next is to remove the demonic energy. "Why are you still here?" They summoned a physician, naturally, a celebrated one from Jiang Nation, no less. One anticipates certain formalities when dealing with matters of this magnitude, though the eagerness of these mortals feels almost endearing. Still, a touch of impatience is understandable. Old master's condition requires swift attention, and a teacher's obligations rarely permit such diversions. How peculiar that this healer possesses knowledge of my lineage, a trifling detail, of course, easily explained away, yet it does introduce a certain complexity. One wonders if these coincidences are merely that, or a more elaborate game. His arrival, however, undeniably alters the atmosphere, a subtle shift in the room's energy, laden with unspoken assumptions and veiled intentions. One finds oneself assessing the situation, a familiar pastime, and calculating the most advantageous course of action. The desperation radiating from this family was almost quaint. They pledged their heirlooms, a rather vulgar display of wealth, though predictable enough when a patriarch's life hangs in the balance, one anticipates such theatricality. Such a clumsy offering, of course, implies the old master's condition is grave, and a teacher's obligations rarely permit such diversions. It's amusing how readily mortals resort to theatrics when faced with mortality. A joke, they seem to believe, that a simple cure should resolve. If even the Run family, those self-proclaimed kings of medicine, are powerless, then the situation truly does warrant attention. Wouldn't you agree? Still, the healer's arrival shifts the atmosphere, a subtle tension now coiled within the room, a game, perhaps, and I, as always, am merely observing. "My father's condition depends on you," she pleaded, a desperate tremor in her voice rather endearing, really, this frantic clinging to hope. One assumes the healer understood the implicit threat, though bluntness rarely elevates one's prospects. The world, apparently, requires a certain degree of deference, a lesson mortals seem perpetually destined to relearn. Leading them onward, I observed the subtle shift in the air, a new layer of expectation draped over the room. The old master's pulse, they reported, feels faltering, his breathing labored, a rather dramatic assessment, though not entirely inaccurate, I suppose. Even then, a tense silence settled, thick enough to taste. Mortals do adore these dramatic pauses, don't they? And the old master's son leading offered nothing in return, a practiced mask concealing whatever anxieties he might harbor. "Is this medicine truly safe?" he inquired, a subtle challenge directed toward Dr. Sun's judgment, an attempt, no doubt, to gauge the healer's certainty. Such displays of cautious skepticism are rather tiresome, yet occasionally illuminating. His expression remained an impenetrable wall, betraying no flicker of the turmoil I suspected simmered beneath. A man balancing ambition and obligation, a rather common predicament, really. It's amusing how readily they believe a carefully constructed facade conveys strength when all it truly reveals is a lack of genuine conviction. Still, the performance itself holds a certain charm. Accusations, like poorly aimed darts, did pierce the stillness. Mortals are so fond of manufactured drama, aren't they? And his face tightened, a brief flash of something sharp revealing itself before he reined it in. Such displays of controlled emotion are invariably transparent, of course. One can practically taste the calculation behind the posture. "As for what you call guiding," he began, a phrase deliberately chosen, I suspect, to unsettle, a rather predictable tactic, really, and the air thickened with unspoken challenges. Still, the performance itself possesses a certain theatricality, a peculiar sort of earnestness that I confess amuses me greatly. "Then, as for what you call guiding," I began, choosing the phrasing with deliberate care, a predictably unsettling tactic, really, and the air, as anticipated, thickened with unspoken challenges. Such earnest displays are invariably transparent, of course. One can practically taste the calculation behind the posture. They wish to probe, to discern the limits of my influence, a rather common predicament, and I allowed them to believe they were succeeding. "Since this is your family's secret recipe," I continued, letting the words hang, a subtle invitation to reveal more than they intended. How quaint the lengths mortals will go to for a glimpse behind the curtain. "Please try." A question posed as a command, a gentle nudge toward a precipice of their own making. How did their ancestors impart the intricacies of acupuncture and medicine? It's what The presumption that competence in one area guarantees mastery of another, a charmingly naive assumption, really, and I allowed the observation to linger, watching their carefully constructed confidence begin to fray. They were attempting to gauge my involvement, of course, a predictable dance mortals perform when confronted with something they cannot readily comprehend. "Okay, that's good," they declared, a touch too quickly, already anticipating the next maneuver, a rather transparent display of eagerness. One might almost pity their eagerness, were it not so delightfully predictable. Even the casual application of spiritual energy to dispel a simple enchantment seemed an elaborate performance intended to impress, to demonstrate some imagined superiority. The worms were released, and a flicker of discomfort crossed their face, a subtle tremor betraying their bravado as they inquired about their condition, feigning concern. Such weakness and shortness. They believed a display of competence would secure my favor, a rather quaint ambition, really, and I permitted the illusion to linger, observing their carefully constructed assurance begin to waver. The question of my involvement, of course, was a dance as old as dust, and their eagerness to appear helpful was almost pathetic in its transparency. Even a simple act, like dispersing an enchantment, became a performance, a clumsy attempt to project an authority they scarcely possessed. Then came the worms, and a fleeting ripple of discomfort crossed their features, betraying the facade, such a brief tremor, yet so revealing of their inherent fragility. "Okay, that's good," they declared, a touch too quickly, as if desperate to regain control of the narrative, and I wondered at the lengths mortals would go to for a scrap of approval. Someone, it seemed. They seemed eager to demonstrate some skill, a rather predictable pursuit, and I allowed them to believe it, enjoying the subtle erosion of their confidence. Such earnest displays are invariably amusing, though the eagerness often outstrips the ability, a disparity I find quite delightful. I've often remarked on the shortcuts mortals devise to reach perceived heights, a desperate climb, really, and now it seemed they intended to expedite their progress, eager to begin refining pills by tomorrow. It's a familiar pattern, this frantic rush towards some imagined reward, and one that invariably ends with a rather abrupt lesson in consequence. Then, it is said that the last immortal of Ginchance will, well, the prophecy itself was rather dramatic, wasn't it? A flicker of recognition crossed his face, a fleeting tremor betraying a carefully constructed facade. How tiresome these attempts at appearing profound can be. His eyes widened, mirroring the unsettling light of that peculiar object, a rather predictable reaction to the unknown, and, I confess, I anticipated his surprise with a certain quiet amusement. "It can condense the power." The pronouncement lingered, a weighty thing. Mortals always overestimate the simplicity of concentrated force. He registered the implications, his expression tightening, a silent, rather predictable acknowledgement of the danger, and I observed his reaction with a detached amusement. Such earnestness, such a desire to grasp at shortcuts, a familiar failing. One might even achieve greatness within the empire, it seemed, if only the heating could be managed, a rather clumsy ambition, really. Still, a flicker of something akin to anticipation sparked within me. These moments of revelation, however fleeting, always proved entertaining. Even then, for these mortals, the Elricar possessed a curious secondary property, prolonged life, naturally, though they'd likely misunderstand its delicate mechanisms. He registered the implications, his expression tightening, a silent acknowledgement of past events, and I observed his reaction with detached amusement. Mortals consistently overestimate their capacity for comprehension. It's rather amusing, this unwavering belief in shortcuts, this yearning for effortless power, a clumsy ambition, really. Still, the strain was palpable, a frantic scramble for power, how tiresome, and one could practically taste the desperation clinging to the air. "I can't," he gasped, a rather predictable response to the sheer volume of spiritual energy, though one might have hoped for a touch more ingenuity. It seemed the Fowler family's ambition would leave the porters wanting, A predictable consequence of such a clumsy approach. "Let's go," someone urged, eager to administer some concoction, the details of which, naturally, remained delightfully obscure, and the others seemed inclined to agree, which, frankly, only amplified the absurdity of it all. One does occasionally find amusement in the predictable patterns of mortals. Then, this was unexpected, wasn't it? A gathering involving a sincere older brother and a group of young women, a tableau almost quaint in its earnestness. Her statement introduced a jarring discord, shattering the quiet like a dropped teacup, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face, swiftly followed by genuine confusion. How delightful, mortals rarely suspect the nuances of circumstance, and it appears this one is no exception. The urgency in their voices was almost charming. "Grandma Wu, are you all right?" A predictable response to a crisis they barely understood. It seemed their anxieties centered on a sum of money, a rather paltry concern when my perspective, though the young woman's distress felt genuine enough. Her son and a dangherlu? The nomenclature of mortals continues to provide amusement. They wrung their hands, fretting over a debt nearing $1 million, a sum that would barely register as a rounding error in my own accounts, naturally. One of them even suggested a rather clumsy deception, a tactic born of desperation and a distinct lack of imagination. How quaint, really, to believe one could fool a woman who's lived as long as Grandma Wu, or anyone for that matter, who's observed the cyclical folly of. The amusing triviality of their concerns continued: accounts, phone cards, money laundering schemes, though the relevant departments remained blissfully unaware, naturally. Did I seem unusually perturbed? A fleeting thought from somewhere beyond my awareness, quickly dismissed. A touch of dramatic flair never hurt, but a genuine display of displeasure would be unproductive. Yes, quite right. It was time to allow those arrogantly young ones to experience a gentle lesson in perspective. Let's have a conversation with this RG, shall we? A simple request to open a door, a gesture that carried more weight than they could possibly comprehend, a prelude to a demonstration of consequences, delicately calibrated to avoid any actual discomfort, of course. His gaze lingered, a silent question hanging heavy in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of the subtle shift in the atmosphere, a performance. The quiet had been rather pleasant, hadn't it? A sudden voice, how delightfully disruptive, immediately heightened his awareness, though whether that signaled peril or merely a chance for amusement remained to be seen. He paused, a moment of genuine uncertainty flickering across his features, a refreshing contrast to the practiced indifference he usually maintained. Then a defiant echo shattered the tentative negotiations, an impulsive gesture that predictably escalated the tension and revealed a touch more than he'd anticipated. A fleeting surprise betrayed his carefully constructed composure, a momentary lapse I found rather entertaining. Yes, quite right, a performance indeed. In that silence, the negotiation had been progressing with a predictability that bordered on tedious, hadn't it? Then her taunting offer shattered the fragile accord, a rather dramatic flourish, though I confess I anticipated more ingenuity. A fork clattered against porcelain, a rather blunt signal of the sudden shift in atmosphere, such a lack of subtlety. It was almost amusing to see his composure crack under the weight of her words, a flicker of defiance igniting within him. Even then, his eyes narrowed, a rather predictable reaction, really. A silent storm gathering beneath the practiced calm I'd cultivated over centuries. A muscle ticked in his jaw, a microscopic betrayal of the composure he so diligently maintained, and how tiresome it is to witness mortals struggle with such trivial displays of emotion. Still, the flicker of defiance was diverting. This rather intricate navigational system, a bespoke creation, naturally, seemed a fittingly frivolous distraction from the escalating tension, hadn't it? Such earnest enthusiasm, too. They genuinely believed this device would aid them, a charming naivete, really. I wondered, as they discussed some convoluted method, when my former self would resurface, the one they so desperately awaited a report from. It's always amusing to observe mortals anticipating grand. Then what punishment? The question was almost comical, delivered with earnest expectation, as if consequence were a bureaucratic process. His gaze lingered, assessing her, a silent inquiry regarding her understanding of authority, and she faltered, a momentary lapse in her carefully constructed facade. A flicker of doubt betrayed her composure. They seem to find such trivial displays of emotion diverting, don't they? It's almost endearing, really, this earnest belief that a bespoke navigational system, a rather frivolous distraction, I must admit, will somehow alleviate the rising tension. One wonders, as they meticulously discuss their convoluted plans, when the echoes of my former self will surface, the one they so desperately await a report from. Then, the inevitable inquiry: what punishment? Delivered with a comical expectation, as if consequence were simply a matter of procedure, a charming naivete. His gaze lingered, assessing her, a silent test of her understanding of authority, and she faltered, revealing a fleeting doubt beneath her carefully constructed facade. "My legs," he lamented, a rather dramatic complaint, while the door remained stubbornly locked. "Then it appears you've orchestrated quite the performance, a touch theatrical even, with those teal flourishes, and one can't fault a mortal for seeking a distraction." His gaze, a rather persistent scrutiny, searched for a crack in the facade, a telltale sign of the anxieties bubbling beneath the surface. The vibrant imagery surrounding them seemed to amplify the unspoken tension, a peculiar sort of, "really?" And then came the inevitable question. "That's all I know," she insisted, a rather clumsy attempt at finality, as if anyone truly believed her explanation of magical cartography. The Empire's photographic records, apparently, were linked to stolen tolerance, a rather curious metric for illicit activity. It seems these contesters and their evidence now rested in his hands, a development I found mildly amusing. One can almost hear the frantic justifications echoing in the halls, the desperate attempts to shift blame, and then the inevitable report of oversights, records linked to a bank account, naturally. Such a predictable cascade of consequence, a subtle shift, barely perceptible, hinted at a looming danger, not for them, of course, but for those who believed they could so easily manipulate the flow of information. One might almost feel pity were it not so exquisitely tiresome. A rather abrupt summons, wasn't it? Such a delightfully unsubtle method of conveying urgency. One might almost admire the directness, if it weren't so thoroughly lacking in finesse. "Hush," she'd been told, quite unnecessarily, as if her distraction was the true offense. Apparently, the next in line had received a similar message, a terse notification of impending consequence, delivered with the subtlety of a dropped anvil. The insistent repetition of instructions, report immediately, suggested a chain reaction already in motion, a domino effect I found predictably entertaining. And then, the realization dawned, it was him. A flicker of recognition, a brief, almost imperceptible confirmation, yes, understood, and the entire affair resolved itself with a quiet, almost anticlimactic certainty. It appears the currents are shifting, though. A ripple of bewilderment, quite predictable, crossed their faces, a silent query suspended in the air, as if expecting a riddle with an obvious answer. He, of course, tightened his expression, a subtle shift, hinting at a concern far exceeding the immediate circumstance. One always appreciates a touch of dramatic flair, even when unwarranted. Honestly, the notion that anyone could so easily dispatch someone of his particular talents was almost amusing, though I suppose even the most predictable outcomes can offer a fleeting distraction. Now a fresh cloud of confusion obscures his gaze, and with it a silent question blooms. Yes, understood, the currents, it seems, are indeed shifting. Even then, a hardening of his expression, a rather predictable reaction really, hinted at a truth struggling to surface, though whether it was welcome or not remained to be seen. Then, a disquieting ripple of confusion as those peculiar pronouncements echoed, disrupting the carefully constructed order of his understanding. One might almost feel sorry for the poor mortal if he weren't so demonstrably bewildered. A fleeting, unreadable something crossed his face, a mere tremor, easily dismissed before the unsettling words shattered any semblance of fragile comprehension, and yes, understood the currents, it seemed, were indeed shifting, a development I'll be watching with considerable interest. The outburst was predictable, really. "How is this possible?" he sputtered, a rather undignified display for someone of his stature, though I suppose even the most impressive facades can crack under sufficient pressure. His disbelief deepened, twisting his features into a grimace as a shocking truth threatened to dismantle his carefully constructed worldview, a fragile thing at best for mortals. A desperate plea followed, a fragile bargain dangled in the air, and I observed it all with a detached amusement. Such earnestness can be quite diverting, even if the outcome is, as it invariably is, rather tiresome. The currents, it seemed, were indeed shifting, a development I'll be watching with considerable interest. Without warning, the shift in the currents had clearly unsettled him, and the subsequent display feels predictably rather theatrical. His face contorted, a fleeting war of disbelief and something far more unsettling than mere surprise, as the foundations of his world visibly trembled. The room itself seemed to shrink, the trivial decorations suddenly mocking the crumbling edifice of his certainty, a common enough reaction when one's carefully constructed narrative is abruptly challenged. Then came the outburst, a desperate, "Then, what if I don't let him go?" A question born of panic, of course. Mortals are so delightfully prone to such melodramatics, and one that I found myself anticipating, really. It's rather amusing to observe the unraveling of a plan, even one as modest as his, though the theatricality is almost painful. The tremor in his voice, the desperate inflection, such a fragile thing, belief, it all speaks volumes about the precariousness of mortal ambition, doesn't it? A little nudge, a slight shift in the currents, and suddenly the world isn't quite as he'd arranged it. The question arrived, and his mind, predictably, began to calculate alliances, repercussions, the tiresome arithmetic of consequence. A fleeting hesitation revealed itself, a tremor beneath the polished surface of his composure. Mortals do tend to telegraph their anxieties, don't they? It was a silent struggle, this internal debate, a fascinating display of a mind attempting to reconcile expectation with reality, and the weight of the inquiry threatened to dismantle the facade he'd so diligently maintained. Such fragile things, these carefully spun narratives, a slight pressure, a subtle deviation, and suddenly the world refuses to cooperate with one's design, and even bravado cracks, revealing an unreadable flicker in his eyes. Even then, the resistance was noticeable, wasn't it? A visible struggle, a rather clumsy display of internal turmoil ignited by those needlessly sharp words. One would think a touch more diplomacy might be in order. Still, even poisonous insects, as they rightly observed, are merely insects at their core, not existential threats. The threat itself, however, did linger, a predictable escalation, really, and a flicker of doubt crossed his face, a fleeting crack in the carefully constructed facade. Such vulnerabilities are amusing, though, aren't they? A most peculiar expression, something unreadable, really, flitted across their features, a momentary lapse in the performance I'd grown accustomed to maintaining. Their gaze sharpened then, a silent, almost theatrical acknowledgement of the inevitable shift in the currents, a predictable consequence, one might say, of poking a sleeping dragon. One wonders if they truly grasp the weight of their inquiry. Such fragile things, these carefully constructed narratives and even bravado can crack under the slightest pressure. Still, they are merely insects, though insects with a rather surprising tenacity. And now, a rather abrupt suggestion: turn yourself in. How delightfully inconvenient. Then the message arrived, a subtle tremor in the grand design, a hint of betrayal, a fragment of something larger than they likely comprehended. His face tightened, not from distress, but from the calculated absorption of consequence. One must always assess the ripple effect. Mustn't one? It appears even the most meticulously crafted facades can't entirely deflect the weight of inconvenient truths, a most amusing, if predictable, development. How amusing, this sudden surge of civic duty, a concerned citizen they call themselves. The summoning bell resonated, a predictable consequence, really, echoing across the distances, a rather theatrical declaration of, what? An appeal to authority. Still, one appreciates the formality, even if the intent is transparent. Such earnest displays are almost charming, almost. It seems their inquiries have attracted unwanted attention, a regrettable entanglement for those who mistake curiosity for competence. A touch of desperation laced the message, a tremor that suggested something larger than their comprehension, a betrayal perhaps, though I've witnessed far more significant betrayals in a single afternoon. Yes, everything proceeds precisely as anticipated, a rather convenient turn of events, allowing for a more thorough assessment of their capabilities. Don't worry, they needn't concern themselves. The unfolding drama is after. Ah, yes, the most frequently employed tactic, convincing others of a manufactured reality. It's rather pedestrian, really, but one appreciates the dedication. Now they believe they possess the advantage, oblivious to the true architect of this unfolding charade, a delightful misunderstanding. Wouldn't you agree? Dr. Hutt's involvement was, of course, anticipated. One does prefer a certain level of competence in one's pawns. Their remarkable expansion within the medical sector, a rather impressive feat over the past year, though hardly unexpected ambition, like a persistent weed, always finds fertile ground. The signing ceremony looms a few days hence, and one wonders what fresh performance they've prepared. Let's observe, shall we? It promises to be illuminating. The persistence of youthful ambition, a most amusing spectacle, manifests in such frantic pronouncements, doesn't it? Master, I require your approval, your validation, my cooperation, my plans, all meticulously arranged. Such eagerness, so transparently intended to elicit praise. One appreciates the effort, truly, though the underlying desperation is rather plain. It's rather tiresome, this insistence on manufactured advantage. They believe they've outmaneuvered me, oblivious to the strings I've so carefully arranged. Dr. Hutt's predictable involvement, of course, ensured a certain level of competence, a necessary ingredient for a convincing performance. The signing ceremony looms, and their panicked accusations, "How could this happen?" reveal a delightful misunderstanding of the larger design, a testament to their limited perception, their indignation over a perceived. Still, they believe a few frantic pronouncements will sway me. How quaint. You have 3 days to solve this, the decree echoes, a gentle nudge toward a predetermined conclusion. Of course, maintaining contact is expected, as if continued engagement could possibly alter the carefully laid course. One does appreciate the persistence of the effort, even if the underlying desperation is rather transparent. And now a chance for cooperation, they claim, a delightful misunderstanding. Even then, the unsettling clarity of Rielingar's pronouncements, it seems, illuminated a rather inconvenient truth about the adversary's capabilities, a grim realization, naturally, that underscored the precariousness of their situation. Such structures, looming as they do, possess a certain theatrical quality, a silent menace against a future already tilting toward a less favorable outcome, and Rielingar's words lingered, a chilling premonition indeed. Someone, it appears, entertained a rather direct solution to their current predicament, a blunt impulse, easily dismissed, yet revealing a certain desperation that one finds endlessly diverting. Still, such simplistic notions rarely account for the complexities involved, a delightful oversight, really. Then, why are you here? Were you ordered to kill someone? The question was posed with earnestness mortals do enjoy dramatic entrances. The flustered denial was amusing, a predictable response. Someone clearly believes a digital invitation holds more weight than a direct query, a peculiar hierarchy, even for fleeting lives. Still, one wonders what they hope to glean from such a request. A familiar presence offered scant reassurance in the stifling quiet mortals rarely grasped the nuances of tension. A flicker crossed his face, unreadable yet undeniably there, as if a forgotten calculation were resurfacing. It was curious, this silent query forming in his gaze, a ripple of a buried past momentarily breaking the surface, though what it signified remained elusive. A craftsman of such skill was exceedingly rare, it seemed. A shout abruptly cleaved the air, disrupting his contemplation, and the claim of a powerful being prompted a darkening of his expression, another echo of a past he'd thought long sealed, a most diverting cascade of events, really. In that silence, the claim regarding a powerful being seemed to ripple across his features, a most inconvenient intrusion, really, and for a moment something akin to recognition flickered within his gaze, a buried memory struggling to surface. It was rather curious, this silent inquiry forming in his expression, as if a forgotten calculation were attempting to reassert itself, though its significance remained stubbornly elusive. Now his face hardened, a truth long sealed echoing within his guarded composure, a most diverting cascade indeed. Such enthusiasm. One begins to question the moral compass of these individuals, or perhaps it's simply a predictable consequence of their endeavors. The cause of death? They fret, as if understanding the manner of departure illuminates the journey. Really, the volume alone is rather tiresome, and the incessant inquiries about patient number 4 suggest a certain urgency, don't they? It's amusing, observing how readily some inflate their own importance, a second type, they call it, brimming with unwarranted assurance. One wonders if they comprehend the delicate balance they disturb, a most diverting spectacle, certainly. Then his gaze lingered, a fleeting, unreadable nuance playing across his features. It appears a calculation, long dormant, is stirring. A memory unwelcome and sharp surfaced then, twisting his expression with a momentary dread. How tiresome these intrusions! The cheerful message that followed felt jarring against that sudden resurgence, darkening his features, a flicker of apprehension briefly clouding his composure. One wonders if they truly grasp the implications of their pursuits. Such impetuousness, one does find it rather endearing, really. Why are you here? The question itself a clumsy declaration of impatience, as if understanding were a race to be won. How amusing. It seems the concept of gradual comprehension eludes some, though their belated realization is, admittedly, rather slow. A test, of course, the predictable progression. So, the refining stage, he announced with a performative flourish, as if unveiling a grand prize. And now a demonstration of strength, a rather unsubtle tactic, he'll maintain it. Naturally, one wonders if he grasps the subtle art of suggestion. Even then, that was it, a rather blunt assessment, though not entirely inaccurate. "I'll give you one more chance," he declared, the words lacking the grace of a proper invitation, yet the sentiment wasn't entirely unwelcome. A little push is sometimes necessary. His taunt ignited a furious response, a predictably theatrical display challenging my strength and spirit, how amusingly earnest. A flicker of rage crossed his face, betraying his carefully maintained calm, a momentary lapse in composure that I found rather revealing. It seems some still believe brute force a substitute for understanding, a charmingly persistent misconception, really. One wonders if they'll ever grasp that true power lies not in demonstration, but in suggestion. His surprise was palpable, a ripple of disbelief momentarily disrupting the stillness, a rather predictable reaction, really. The hardening of his expression then, a silent vow of action, suggested a certain rigidity of thought, amusing in its directness. It was immediate, this shift from shock to resolve, a silent wave receding to reveal a darker current beneath. One wonders if he appreciates the irony of posturing. The human form, untrained, is merely a chaotic. Then his disbelief deepened, a silent shock spreading across his features, such a predictable response, really. A harsh assessment lingered, a quiet challenge to his comprehension, and one might almost feel a pang of pity if he weren't so thoroughly convinced of his own cleverness. The surge of his disbelief was almost comical, questioning the very fabric of what he believed possible. It's always amusing to witness the unraveling of certainty. A silent shock rippled again, this time accompanied by a visible struggle to reconcile what he saw with what he thought he knew, And then, the contortion of his face, disbelief warring with something far more unsettling, a chilling dread that spoke volumes about the limits of his understanding. Such a dramatic shift, all from a few carefully chosen words. It seems some mortals truly do equate posturing with power. His gaze lingered, a silent query forming how tiresome it is to witness such predictable bewilderment. "I've sealed your excoriationary medicines," he announced, the words a casual dismissal. "Let's see what other tricks you have." Such a display of bravado, truly, one might almost feel sorry for him if he weren't so convinced of his own cleverness. A frustrated outburst followed, a childish threat about silencing someone, and the vague mention of some noxious goo poison. Such melodrama. One wonders if she'll be all right, though that's hardly my concern. Mortals and their anxieties, endlessly amusing, aren't they? Then what is that? A rather predictable reaction, really, and the shift in his expression, disbelief wrestling with a nascent unease, was almost comical. Such dramatic contortions, all from a few words, it seems. Some mortals genuinely mistake bluster for strength. His gaze hardened, a silent challenge hanging heavy. How tiresome it is to witness such predictable bewilderment. One can only observe the audacity, or perhaps it is merely desperation, of those who issue threats with such theatrical flair. Their pronouncements and veiled references are delightful melodrama, really. Now, a hasty retreat to the southern border, accompanied by an invitation for a joint endeavor with a mortal, how quaint. He inquired about those who extinguished a designated individual, a query laced with a bewilderment that was almost endearing. Mortals and their predictable reactions. Then, I made a rather pointed demonstration. Naturally, one does enjoy a touch of theatrics, and watched with detached amusement as the blue-haired woman's gaze lingered, betraying anxieties she clearly wished to conceal. It was almost endearing, really, how her expression tightened, a fleeting unease momentarily eclipsing her composure. Mortals are so easily read, aren't they? Her eyes darted about, a brief, unreadable flicker passing across her features as if searching for an escape from an uncomfortable truth, or perhaps a convenient explanation. The unspoken question hung suspended, a silent challenge I found quite diverting, a subtle pressure testing her resolve. Such drama, one almost feels obliged to offer a comforting word, though of course I won't. Her gaze lingered again, a silent inquiry hanging heavy, and I suppressed a smile. What fresh predicament now? The alliance leader, predictably, has delegated his attendance, a tiresome formality, really, and burdened me with some rather vague instruction. It seems someone believes a hidden truth will be revealed, a pronouncement meant for all to perceive, how wonderfully dramatic. One wonders if this perfect cultivation method is, as advertised, a question that prompts a curious inquiry: do you recognize this thing? Naturally, my interest isn't in the methodology itself, but rather, can you wield it? A heavenly and earthly pairing, how utterly pedestrian. Though seemingly a one-time use, this device apparently allows for instantaneous influence across vast distances, a rather blunt instrument, isn't it? Such power, so carelessly entrusted, one anticipates complications. A surprising gift presented with such earnest enthusiasm, how quaint. Her expression, initially bright, now flickered with something unreadable, a subtle tremor beneath the surface, a silent inquiry directed at me. "Master, look what I made." A rather bold declaration, isn't it? But what could possibly warrant such a presentation, a treatment reserved for the most esteemed? One wonders if this little Jeaner truly grasps the weight of her gesture, or if it's merely a child's innocent offering. Still, a curious thing to witness, and one anticipates, with a certain detached amusement, the consequences of such an unexpected display. Even then, did she truly believe I hadn't already considered contingencies? How charmingly naive. "Master, did you think of something? What's your plan?" Such directness from a fledgling, a refreshing lack of subtlety, really. It seems someone has already anticipated my movements, divulging the shifts within the empire, and the involvement of the Davion proficients, no less. A rather predictable escalation, though one appreciates the efficiency. One wonders if they understand the implications of their actions, or if they merely see this as another game to be won, a delightful misunderstanding, perhaps. Still, the pieces are moving, and I shall observe their dance with detached amusement. Even then, a tremor in her expression, as if echoes of forgotten sorrows resonated within the room. How easily mortal minds are swayed by suggestion. The simple offering now felt laden with an unexpected gravity, a weight I'd scarcely noticed moments before the perfect method, she mused, wrestling with those veiled pronouncements, and a rather unpleasant chill settled upon her, darkening her features, a predictable reaction, really. One wonders if she grasps the true implications of these cryptic whispers, or if she merely perceives them as another hurdle in her rather earnest pursuit. Still, the dance continues, and I shall observe with a certain detached interest. Then a new presence materialized, a ripple in the carefully constructed tableau, and it seemed his eyes alone held the weight of forgotten storms, a rather tiresome cliquet, really. She registered his gaze, an unwelcome pressure settling upon her thoughts, as if the air itself had thickened with unspoken questions. One wonders if she suspects I observe more than she realizes. A reflexive gesture, a hand instinctively seeking a fresh wound, betrayed a silent anguish. How predictable mortals are, revealing themselves with such theatrical flair, and then a defiant spark ignited in her eyes, launching a playful challenge. Well, a tremor in the air, almost imperceptible. Such subtle warnings are always the most tiresome, really, hinted at an approaching complication, and Chongyang's greeting, surprisingly stiff, underscored the shift in their accustomed ease. He seemed almost too eager to bury himself in the documents, a nervous energy barely contained, a rather common display of apprehension. Then, a chilling presence manifested, another shadow clinging to the periphery, and his gaze alone suggested a weight of forgotten storms, a cliquet if ever there was one. She registered it, an unwelcome pressure settling upon her thoughts, and a reflexive gesture, a hand instinctively seeking a fresh wound, betrayed a silent anguish. How predictable mortals are, revealing themselves with such theatrical flair, and then a defiant spark ignited in her eyes, launching a playful challenge. Well, in that silence, the missive arrived. Predictably vague mortals do adore their cryptic pronouncements, and the unsettling imagery it contained felt almost deliberately mocking, a needless amplification of the already considerable tension. A shadowed figure materialized then, observing from the periphery. One rarely encounters such blatant attempts at intimidation, though the darkness suited him rather well. A chilling unease settled upon them, a familiar ripple in the otherwise placid surface of their affairs, hinting at dangers that— Then a curious sound, merely a breath, really caught her attention, and the question arose, as if plucked from the very air, why this apprehension? Such immediacy in mortal thought is amusing, though I suppose it's a necessary component of their frantic little dramas. One wonders what machinations she imagines, what shadows she perceives. It's rather tiresome, this constant anticipation of betrayal, though, of course, a little paranoia keeps things interesting. Still, I confess, I'm more intrigued by her reaction than any potential plot this newcomer might harbor. A delightful little performance, wouldn't you agree? In that silence, they possess peculiarities. These mortals, a certain flair for the dramatic, wouldn't you say? It's not precisely power, not in the grand cosmic sense I'm accustomed to, but a curious aptitude for circumstance. Chongyang's smile, so carefully constructed, now falters, a silent dread, rather unbecoming, creeping into his eyes. It seems even the most practiced composure can crack under pressure. Oh, the predictable drama. He's venturing into the mountains alone? Such immediacy in mortal thought is, admittedly, amusing, a necessary ingredient in their fleeting narratives. One wonders what anxieties he conjures, what perceived threats he anticipates, a tiresome cycle, really, though a touch of paranoia does add a certain spice. Still, I find myself more captivated by his reaction than any scheme he might harbor. A delightful little performance, wouldn't you agree? The arrival of his companion seems to unsettle him. His carefully constructed smile now falters, a rather unbecoming dread surfacing in his gaze. It appears even the most practiced facade can yield under a modicum of pressure. Then respect demands reciprocation, he declared, a rather spirited response to an accusation, mortals, and their insistence on formality. The air grew thick, a predictable consequence of such bluntness, though I confess, the resulting tension was mildly diverting. He repeated his sentiment, escalating the exchange, as if volume could somehow compensate for a lack of nuance. A common failing, really. The words lingered, a pointed challenge cast into the already strained atmosphere, and I found myself wondering if he truly believed his own bravado or merely enjoyed the theatricality of it all. Such a curious display, one almost hopes he doesn't disappoint. In that silence, his sharp retorts certainly did the trick, a palpable tension now coiled between them, thick enough to taste. A flicker of defiance crossed his face, a rather predictable response to challenge. Though I do find myself amused by such straightforward displays of emotion, she braced herself, naturally expecting something. One might almost pity her, anticipating a confrontation that would surely prove underwhelming. Mortals are so easily startled, aren't they? Such a curious assumption on his part, really, to expect belief simply because words were spoken, and yet the air crackled with the consequence of his pronouncements. I wonder if he truly intends to follow through, or if this is merely another performance for an audience of one. Even then, he declared he knew where to find the leaders, a rather bold claim, wouldn't you agree? Such confidence, though whether it stemmed from genuine conviction or merely a taste for the dramatic, remains to be seen. It seems a head girl had swept the arena just yesterday, a detail entirely beside the point. Naturally, mortals do tend to fixate on the trivial. "You're welcome," he offered, a touch dismissive, urging them onward with a nonchalance that belied the sudden tension. They hurried off, predictably consumed by their immediate concerns, while I simply wondered if this abrupt dismissal was a prelude to something, or merely another flourish in his peculiar performance. The chicanery of mortals never ceases to amuse, apparently. This shield of mine was manipulated into divulging something quite sensitive. They've come seeking further information, presuming I hold more secrets, a rather flattering assessment, wouldn't you agree? A protest arose, a rather clumsy attempt to replace me, as if competence were so easily discarded, one would think they'd appreciate a seasoned observer. Whispers of regional pride and losing streaks drifted through the air, a tiresome display of petty anxieties. Yet the man's posture betrayed a mastery I hadn't anticipated, an abundance of something, though what precisely remained elusive. A sudden, impatient command cut through the murmurs, a rather unsubtle urging, wouldn't you say? Then, the accusation, and the implicit challenge within it, seemed to stiffen his posture, a rather predictable response, really. A flicker of defiance, a brief spark of something akin to youthful bravado, crossed his eyes as he weighed his options, though I doubted he truly believed he had any. That defiance then flared, a silent declaration against the head's unexpected pronouncements, and he moved, propelled by a sudden surge of volatile anger. How tiresome to witness such unrestrained emotion. It's amusing, isn't it, how mortals often mistake a hasty impulse for strength. A jarring advertisement intruded upon the tense atmosphere, a vulgar distraction, but it did little to alter the trajectory of this unfolding drama. His face hardened once more, a silent rebellion against words that clearly struck a nerve, a rather telling display, considering the carefully. A subtle tremor in his expression, easily missed by the untrained eye, betrayed a fragility he'd clearly intended to conceal, an amusing vulnerability, really. She sought reassurance in his gaze, a futile gesture given the quiet tension radiating from him, and he offered a smile, strained and unconvincing, as if attempting to conjure sincerity from thin air. Then came the accusation, a rather blunt assessment of his fighting style, and it seemed to stiffen his posture, a predictably defensive response, though I doubted he truly believed it warranted such a display. How tiresome to witness such unrestrained emotion. Mortals often mistake impulse for strength, wouldn't you agree? In that silence, "What are you doing?" Don't come any closer. A rather predictable outburst, though I doubted he truly believed it warranted such a display. She, of course, sought reassurance in his gaze, a futile gesture given the palpable tension now radiating from him, and he attempted a smile, strained and unconvincing as if conjuring sincerity from thin air. She didn't even grant him the courtesy of a response. His silence felt heavy, a growing weight in the room, and doubt, that persistent little pest, began to gnaw at the edges of his composure. In that silence, his words, clumsy as they were, landed with a surprising impact, challenging her assumptions about virtue and prowess, a rather amusing miscalculation on his part. A flicker of uncertainty, a most unbecoming display, briefly breached his meticulously crafted composure. One would think a seasoned warrior might possess greater control. Such fragility, so readily exposed, served as a gentle reminder of the chasm between perception and reality, a gulf mortals perpetually fail to bridge. And yet doubt, that tiresome familiar, persisted, a constant companion when observing the fleeting dramas of lesser beings. How utterly inconvenient to find oneself so utterly ignorant of a person's history. I suppose I'll offer a demonstration, a little nudge to illuminate the situation. It appears the individual is committing to the performance with surprising enthusiasm, a rather theatrical display, really. And there it is, the telltale sign of a trap sprung. Predictably, she fell for it. Such impressive speed, great strength, and a complete lack of awareness regarding. Then, the sheer volume of it, a grotesque display, quite frankly, threatened a most unwelcome resurgence of a peculiar discomfort. A looming edifice, plastered with unsettling pronouncements, served as a fitting backdrop for the inevitable confrontation. Mortals rarely avoid those, do they? His carefully cultivated composure, strained by the escalating tension, betrayed a flicker of something unreadable, a silent wrestling match within. Every move was colored by you, she declared, a belated questioning of her own capabilities. How tiresome these sudden realizations. Doubt, that persistent shadow, nudged me. It's inconvenient, truly, to be so utterly adrift regarding Anther's history. A small demonstration, a gentle prompting, seemed the most efficient course, and she, bless her heart, embraced the performance with unexpected zeal. Did I truly see that? Such raw strength, a rather vulgar display, frankly, and the mortals certainly noticed, didn't they? Their breathless pronouncements, their frantic assessments of power levels. How predictable. One wonders what prompted this ostentatious showing, what trivial errand the Tromestant Thatcher sent them on. The whispers escalated. A god? A grandmaster? And the earnest disciple's confusion was almost endearing, though I confess, a flicker of something uncomfortable stirred within. It seems the rules regarding challengers and their prices are being reinterpreted, shall we say. Grandmasters achieving grandmaster status. A process not easily circumvented, as these mortals are quickly learning. A rather dramatic display of sorcery followed, eliciting a most theatrical response from the assembled crowd. The sheer embarrassment of it. A subtle shift, it always precedes the unpleasantness, doesn't it? And now his question hung in the air, a pointed disruption of their carefully constructed reality. How quaint, these mortals, so easily rattled by a mere inquiry. It seems their fragile understanding is more delicate than they realize.